Hiya, Star Boys. I, ugh, I've been in this house for so long. Why are you so dirty, Fernando? What'd you get into? So this is part 2 of making wax, and this is the natural recipe that I made. I made it. Definitely made it. Having a lot of brain problems right now. I made this recipe because a lot of the other natural recipes out there are not as safe and a lot harder to do, and this one is definitely not one of those things. It's definitely improving upon at least one of those things I said. Yes. This recipe has 3 ingredients, all of which are food safe. You could eat them, but I don't recommend eating them. Probably don't eat them. I'm not suggesting that you eat them. I'm just saying that you could probably eat them and you would probably be fine, but don't. Why is my rock boy so dirty? Why is everything so dirty? Did I? Probably just didn't clean. So the 3 ingredients for this recipe are resin. I use pine resin of an unspecified type because I have forgotten, and will probably put all the information on the screen because I don't feel like looking it up right now. Beeswax. This is unbleached beeswax. You can get beeswax that is white. I don't know how it affects this recipe. I've never used it. But if you want to try, you know. This was a mistake. I've made a mistake. Mistake. This wax, whose name I can never remember. I never remember how to say it. It starts with a C. It's like Konoba wax? Konoba wax? Konobu wax? I'm just gonna say a different C word every time it's on the screen. Coffee wax. I also highly suggest you have a silicone mold or some wax paper or something that will allow you to let the wax completely cool before you use it, and I'll explain why later, but just keep it in mind before you start. This one's dirty. Everything I have is dirty right now. What did I do? You will also need a pigment. I almost forgot. You will also need a pigment. Don't forget, you need a pigment. Man, my brain, whew. My thoughts are all over the place right now. Where is my brain at? Aha! One try. Take that. The order of the ingredients doesn't really matter, but I like to start with the resin. Just a good old chunk boy. So next you add the beeswax, but not too much. If you add too much, it won't harden again. That might be too much. Whoops. Didgeridoo. And the last ingredient is the Caribbean wax. You want a fair amount of caribou wax, because if you mess up the amount of beeswax, this does help it remain crisp. Crisp. I love saying the word crisp. It's a crisp word. Crisp. Now this is going to melt down into something way too watery to use to seal. That is expected. Once it is completely liquidy, you add the pigment. I'm going to use like a burgundy color. I feel like it blends nicely with the yellow undertones in this, and that's something you have to keep in mind. The yellow. So once it's all melted and very liquidy and also full of pigment, you're going to put it in a mold or on wax paper. I'm not gonna lie, I've never actually put it on wax paper, but I don't see why that wouldn't work. I've always used silicone. So I'm gonna pour very carefully, and I'm gonna get it everywhere, like I do every time. And we are going to let that cool. And I'm not going to do that on camera because it takes a while to cool all the way through. I got a little distracted playing Animal Crossing, but that means that these are definitely cool. So we will just pop them out. Boop. And yep. So here's the deal with this wax. You need to heat it up until it is liquidy enough to pour, but not as liquidy as it was when we put the pigment in it. That's really the only difference between this and the wax that you can buy professionally made. I have some Bank of England sealing wax, and they don't tell you how they make that, so I have no idea how, but it does have a better consistency when fully heated, and use ingredients that aren't always safe. A lot of them use shellac, and they use a different type of resin, which I have no idea what type. So I'm going to put this back in here. But at one point during this, I am going to remove the spoon from the heat. And I'm going to do that occasionally. I'm going to melt this just right. I'm just going to put it down for a second so I get the paper ready. This is like those holders that seem to keep the spoon really far away from the candle. This is probably why. Very early recipes were just beeswax and resin, and I'm assuming back then it also used to get way too watery. Now they use other resins and shellac and all the stuff I was talking about earlier, and they make it stay a little bit thicker, even when you heat it up really hot. But both recipes, mine and the professional ones, should not be used with stamps that are very deep or are made of certain metals. I don't actually know which metals it is. It's like, it's like these. These don't come off very easily. As I was saying, the professional recipes that I have, that I've bought sticks from. A lot of noise in the hallway. The professional recipes that I have, wax I've bought made professionally. Why can't I formulate that sentence? It also gets stuck to my stamps if it's too hot. I guess that's just a quality of resin-based waxes. The resin-based waxes will get stuck to your stamp if they're too, wow. Whew. I'm gonna have a fun time editing this. The professional waxes that I own, like the Bank of England wax that I own, which I have a piece of right here, this type, it also gets stuck to your stamps if you heat it up too much, even though it doesn't get as liquidy as the recipe that I make. When you heat it up a lot, it still will fuse to your stamp if it's too hot when you pour it and put the stamp on it. I think that's just a product of it being made of resin, tree resin, no matter what type. It fuses to things. I think that's just what resin do. That's how resin be. We're almost there. Let's see. I'm gonna have a fun time editing this. When the stamp is very deep, you just have to be careful. Okay, now I'm gonna use some of that professionally made wax. I have way too big of a piece. Where is my knife? Knife. Try and break some off. Whoop. Now I have some of that professionally made wax, which I do have to admit is a bit shinier than mine, and I'm jealous. But I guess that's what you get when you use shellac, which I assume they use. I'm making this way too hot. I'm gonna have to cool it off a little bit by putting it down on the stone. And you don't have to put it in a mold or on wax paper, by the way. You can just take the spoon off the heat and let it cool until it gets to the consistency you're comfortable using. It's too hot. Immediately too hot. Did not clip that wick, and I regret it. This stuff's also a pain to get off your tools. It sticks to everything. Like, everything. Look at that. That one came off much easier than it has in the past. It's all about temperature. My attempt with the recipe that I made was still a little bit too hot. I'm sure you noticed this one was a little bit thicker, and that helped a lot. Okay, here they both are side by side, and I'm going to open and snap the seal. We will start with mine. Got this. Which did snap and break, though it seemed to have trouble adhering to the paper. And here is the professionally made one, which also had trouble adhering to the paper, but would have also snapped nicely if I had been able to do it. I think maybe my paper doesn't take to the wax quite the way I wanted it to. Also, this is sticky. Why is it sticky? And that is my wax and the professionally made wax. The professionally made wax is much harder to make. I've actually never attempted that recipe, even though I've seen them online. My wax is sort of a cheaper back alley way of doing it, where you don't have to use a double boiler or a stove, you don't have to make things too hot, you don't have to use shellac, you don't have to use more expensive, harder to get ingredients. And it's also very important that you keep it at the right temperature when you pour. My stamp almost got stuck, I'm sure you saw. And that's because it was just on the brink of being cool enough. I was a little bit impatient. I managed to pour the professional one at the correct temperature, and it worked out pretty well, but trust me, I've gotten that wax stuck all up in my stamps before, and it is a pain to get out. The type of stamp you use is also very important for this. So even though these three stamps are much more shallow than the stamp that I used in this video, which is this one, which is blue from a time I used it on a crayon for another video. Even though these three stamps are much more shallow, they're not made of brass. This one is made of probably white metal. This one. I don't know what that one or that one are made of. No idea. And they definitely get stuck more easily to this type of wax, even when I keep it within the correct temperature, even if it's a little bit too overheated. But here is a much cheaper alternative if you want to make this type of stamp for like a D&D campaign or a themed party where you're handing out the or a themed party where you're handing out the invitations instead of mailing them. But if you have the funds, I suggest you purchase the Bank of England wax. Honestly, I personally don't think this type of wax is worth it, considering you can't mail it. Modern wax, like my other recipe, is easier to make, has a clear base so the color looks better, can go through the mail, and is much easier to clean up after. Stay clean, stay safe, wash your hands. Yes, a very uplifting end to the video. Here's how you make my wax. It's not as good as the other wax. Also, I don't suggest you use this type of wax. The end. I'm very good at promoting myself. Here's my crappy recipe. Here's, people who make it better but don't tell anyone how they make it because it's a big old secret. And I wouldn't use it anyway because I think both are kind of, overrated and a bit of a hassle. But that's my personal opinion. Also, I can't make it glow in the dark or anything as easily. I like my glow in the dark stamps. My color changing ones. Anyway, don't use this recipe. Bye.